Hi, everyone. My name's Michael, and welcome to HR Insight. Most people think HR gets involved when there's already a problem. Somebody complained, somebody got written up, somebody is about to get fired, somebody said something they shouldn't have, violated a policy. And yes, HR does get involved in those situations. But what people don't always understand is that a lot of the time, HR sees the problem forming long before anyone wants to admit it. Not because HR is spying on people, not because HR is sitting around and waiting to see someone get a write up, not because HR wants to make things more complicated. It's because usually HR sits in the middle of everything. We hear from employees, managers, leadership. We see documentation. We see complaints. We see attendance issues. We see turnover, policy questions. We see the same names, the same departments, the same situations, and the same patterns show up over and over again. So, in this video, I want to talk about what HR sees before everyone else does. Because good HR is not just reacting to problems. Good HR is paying attention to keep things from becoming a problem. And I think that's where a lot of people misunderstand the role. I think they see HR as the policy police, but good HR is really trying to see things before they break down and before they turn into something bigger. So let's talk about it. One of the first things HR sees before everyone else does is communication breaking down. And honestly, a lot of workplace issues start right there, not with bad intent, not with someone trying to cause a problem, not even always with poor performance. Sometimes the issue is that people are just actually not on the same page. Leadership thinks the message was clear. The manager thinks they explained the expectation, and the employee says, "Nobody ever told me that." And HR is sitting there realizing that everyone thinks they communicated, but somehow the message still did not land. And that happens all the time. A policy changes, but only half the team understands it. A manager gives instruction, but does not explain what success actually looks like. An employee is told to do better, but nobody defines what better means. A leader assumes everyone knows the standard, but the standard has never really been explained clearly. And then everyone gets frustrated. The manager is frustrated because they think the employee is not listening. The employee is frustrated because they feel like expectations keep changing. Leadership is frustrated because they think the issue should have been handled already. And HR is usually the one trying to figure out where the communication actually broke. Because a lot of the times that is the real issue. It is not always that people are refusing to follow expectations. Sometimes the expectations were never clear to begin with. And that is an important distinction, because if the expectation was never clear, you cannot jump straight to discipline and act like the employee failed some obvious standard. You have to back it up. What was communicated? Who communicated it? When was it communicated? Was it documented? Was it consistent? Did the employee understand what was expected? This is the stuff HR is looking at, not because HR wants to overcomplicate the situation, but because if you do not fix the communication issue, the same problem is going to happen again. Maybe with the same employee, maybe a different employee, maybe in the same department, maybe not, but it will come back. And this is one of those areas where managers sometimes think HR is slowing them down. They will say, well, this employee should know better. And maybe they should, but HR still has to ask, okay, but what did we actually tell them? Did we actually coach them? Did we actually document the conversation? Or are we assuming they should have picked it up along the way? The difference matters, because assumptions create problems. Clear expectations usually prevent them. So the first thing HR sees before everyone else does is when the workplace is operating on assumptions instead of actual communication. Another thing HR sees before everyone else does is manager avoidance. And this is a big one. A lot of workplace problems do not become major because the original issue was impossible to solve. They become major issues because someone avoided dealing with it when it was still small. Attendance is a good example of this. Maybe it's not terrible at first. Maybe it is a one call out here, one call out there. The manager notices, but they do not address it, and then it keeps happening. Now other employees are getting frustrated because they feel like they are picking up the slack. The scheduler gets harder to manage the issue. The manager is irritated. The team is irritated. And then eventually someone calls HR and says, we need to do something about this employee. And one of the first things HR is going to ask, what conversations have you already had? And that's where it gets quiet, because usually the answer is none. No conversation, no counseling, no documentation, no clear expectation, no warning that the pattern was becoming a problem. Just months of frustration that never turned into actual management of the employee from the manager. And this is not an employee relations issue only. This is a leadership issue, because one of the biggest things HR sees is not just employee behavior. It is management avoidance. Managers avoiding hard conversation, avoiding documentation, managers avoiding conflict, managers hoping that the problem fixes itself, letting something go for weeks or months and then suddenly wanting HR to make it disappear. But HR cannot go back in time and manage the situation for you. We can guide the next step, we can clean up the process. HR can help protect consistency, make sure the response is appropriate, but HR cannot magically create all the conversations that should have happened earlier. And that is where managers will get frustrated with HR, because HR may say, we need to coach first, or we need to document the expectation, or give the employee a chance to correct the issue. And the manager is thinking, why are we giving them another chance? This has been going on forever. But from HR's perspective, the problem may have been going on forever in the manager's head, but it has not been properly addressed on the record. And that matters. You cannot skip the leadership part and then expect HR to jump straight to the final step. This is where I think managers have to understand something. HR is not telling you to tolerate bad performance. HR is usually telling you to manage it correctly. Those are not the same thing. There is a big difference between ignoring an issue and giving someone a clear, documented opportunity to improve. One is avoidance, the other is management. And HR can usually tell which one happened. So when HR sees manager avoidance, we know the issue is probably going to get bigger, because the longer you avoid the conversation, the fewer cleanup options you have later. Another thing HR sees before everyone else does is patterns. Most people see the incident in front of them. HR is usually looking at the pattern behind it. It's a major difference. A manager can call about one employee, and an employee may complain about one situation. Leadership may ask about one department, but HR is often connecting that one situation to 5 other things we've already seen. The same department keeps losing people. The same supervisor keeps having complaints. The same shift keeps having conflict. The same employees keep showing up in attendance conversations, attitude concerns, performance issues, or coworker conflicts. One incident may not tell the whole story, but repeated incidents start to paint the larger picture. And that is something HR is trained to pay attention to, because in the workplace, the first version of the problem is not always the real problem. Sometimes the first version sounds like, this employee has an attitude, but the pattern might show that the supervisor gives unclear instructions, plays favorites, and only certain employees are being held accountable. Sometimes it sounds like nobody wants to work anymore, but the pattern might show that one department has poor onboarding, or weak training, inconsistent scheduling, or a leader who does not address problems fairly. Sometimes the first version sounds like, this person is always causing drama, but the pattern might show that nobody has ever clearly addressed the behavior, so it keeps spreading. That is why HR has to look beyond the one moment, because one moment can be misleading. A single complaint may be valid or it may be incomplete. A single write-up may be appropriate or it may be inconsistent. A single resignation may not mean much, but 5 resignations from the same department might mean something is happening there. And that is where HR can be really valuable, because HR is not just asking what happened today. HR is asking what keeps happening. The question matters, because if the same issue keeps coming back, then you do not have just an employee problem. You have a process problem, a leadership problem, a communication problem, a training problem, or even a culture problem. And if you treat the incident, you might miss the pattern. This is why I always think leaders have to be careful when they say, "Oh, this is just a one-off." Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes it is only a one-off to the person who has not been tracking it every day. HR sees the issue repeat. HR sees the same name keep coming up. We see the department where things keep getting messy. HR sees when something that looks isolated is actually part of a bigger trend. And again, that does not mean HR is assuming the worst. It means HR is paying attention, because patterns are usually where the real work is. HR sees risk before it looks like risk. And I do not mean that in a dramatic way. Not every issue is some massive potential legal problem, and not every conversation needs to turn into a corporate investigation. And not every employee concern is a crisis yet. But HR does tend to see when something simple is starting to turn into something complicated. A leave request that gets handled casually, an accommodation comment that nobody follows up on, a complaint that gets brushed off because the manager thinks it's just drama, a termination that leadership wants to move quickly on, but the documentation is weak. I could go on. A policy that is enforced strictly with one employee, but ignored with another. A performance issue that is real, but has never been clearly communicated. Those are the situations where HR starts paying attention, because what looks simple on the surface can become complicated very quickly if it is handled the wrong way. For example, a manager might say, "This employee is calling out too much. I want to terminate them." And maybe the attendance really is an issue, but HR is going to ask more questions. Are they on approved leave? Have they mentioned a medical condition? Have they requested accommodation? Have we applied the attendance policy consistently? Have we documented the absences correctly? Have we had the right conversations? This does not mean the employee automatically gets a pass. It means HR has to make sure the process is clean before the company takes action. Because sometimes what looks like simple management issue is an employment issue, and the earlier HR catches that, the better. Same with complaints. A manager may say they are just being dramatic. Okay, maybe, but what did they actually say? Did they mention harassment? Did they mention discrimination? Say they feel unsafe? Did they say a supervisor is treating them differently? Did they say they reported something and nothing happened? Those details matter, and HR is going to hear those words differently than someone who is just annoyed by the complaint. Not because HR is trying to make it bigger, but because HR knows certain things that require follow-up. You do not get to ignore something just because it's inconvenient. You do not get to dismiss a concern just because the employee is difficult. You do not get to skip the process just because you are frustrated. And honestly, this is one of the most important parts of HR. HR is often the person in the room saying, "Slow down, let's make sure we are handling this the right way." That can frustrate people, but it is usually necessary. Once something is handled poorly, it is much harder to fix later. I think this is where people confuse HR being cautious with HR being difficult. Sometimes HR is not saying no. Sometimes we are. HR is saying not like that. There is a difference. HR may agree the behavior needs to be addressed. HR may agree that the employee is creating a problem. HR may agree that leadership has a valid concern, but HR is looking at timing, documentation, consistency, communication, and whether the process makes sense as a whole. This is not HR being difficult. This is HR doing the job. HR sees culture forming in real time, and I think this is one of the most overlooked parts of HR. People talk about culture like it's this big, abstract thing. Mission statements, core values, team building events, employee appreciation posts, posters on the wall, and all of that can have a place. But that is not really where culture is built. Culture is built in the day-to-day. It's built what leaders tolerate. It is built what managers avoid, what gets addressed, what gets ignored. It is built by who gets held accountable and who gets a pass, how quickly concerns are handled. It is built whether good employees feel supported or taken for granted, and HR should see that. HR sees when a workplace says one thing but practices another. HR sees when leadership says accountability matters, but certain people are allowed to keep causing problems. HR sees when employees stop reporting concerns because they do not believe anything will happen. HR sees when good employees get tired of carrying the weight for people who are not being managed. And HR sees when morale is just not low because people are negative, but because people have been watching the same issue go unresolved for too long. That is culture. Culture is not always created by one big decision. A lot of the time, culture is created by repeated small decisions. The conversation you avoided, the behavior you excused, the standard you lowered, the issue you ignored. The person you allowed to keep damaging the team because addressing it felt uncomfortable. Those things become the culture. And HR can usually see it forming before leadership wants to call it culture. Because the time leadership says, we have a culture problem, HR has often been seeing the signs happen for a while. Turnover, complaints, disengagement, cliques, conflict, inconsistent accountability, managers blaming employees, employees not trusting managers. Those things do not happen out of nowhere. They build, and HR should see the buildup. This is also where I think leaders need to be honest with themselves. Sometimes the culture is not off because employees are difficult. It's off because leadership has been inconsistent. It's off because managers are not aligned. The culture is off because people have learned that certain standards are optional. And once people learn that, it is very hard to undo. That is why HR is always paying attention to what is being repeated, because what gets repeated becomes normal. And what becomes normal becomes the culture. So when I say HR sees things before everyone else does, I do not mean HR has some secret HR power. I mean, HR is usually in a position to see the connections, the complaints, the documentation, the turnover. The manager who keeps avoiding conversations, the employee concern that keeps resurfacing, the department that always seems to have conflict, the policy that is being applied inconsistently, the culture that everyone feels but nobody has named it. HR sees those pieces, and good HR does not just look at them separately. Good HR asks, what is this telling us? Because most workplace issues do not start as explosions. They start as small things that go unaddressed. A vague expectation, a missed conversation, a pattern nobody wants to call out, a manager avoiding conflict, a complaint that was brushed off. And then eventually, everyone acts surprised when it turns into a bigger issue. But HR usually saw it coming. That is why the role matters. HR is not trying to control everything. We are not there to protect bad employees. HR does not want to make managers' lives harder. HR is there to keep the workplace functioning and to function better, to keep communication clear, to help managers manage, to protect consistency, spot patterns, slow things down that need to be handled carefully, and to speak up when something is becoming bigger than people realize. So if you are a manager, do not wait until the issue is out of control to involve HR. If you are an employee, understand that HR may be looking at more than just the one situation in front of you. And if you are in HR, Remember this, your value is not just knowing the policy. Your value is in seeing what is really happening before it becomes impossible to ignore. Good HR is not just reacting to problems. Good HR is paying attention to what keeps becoming a problem. That is the part of HR people do not always see. And that is exactly why it matters. That's the insight for today. If you found this useful, stick around. I'll see you in the next one.